Today we're featuring a new book which is being launched called Through Our Eyes, 30 Years of People Living with HIV, Responding to the HIV and AIDS Epidemics in Australia. And to talk about this book today and to hear some readings from the book, we have the person that's chiefly put the book together, the editor, John Rule, who's worked with NAPWA, the National Association of People with HIV in Australia. John's got a long history of working with NAPWA, and recently he's been working on this book Through Our Eyes, and he's here in the studio to talk about it today.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for inviting me in.
And the book's been launched this month now, and are you doing that across Australia?
Yeah, well, this is the Victorian launch, really, at the International AIDS Conference that was held in Melbourne last year. We had already produced the book, and we made it available to delegates who had attended the conference in Melbourne last year. In Sydney in November, the NAPWA Association had what they call a national launch, and we were lucky to have the Honourable Michael Kirby come along and do that very formal launch on a national basis. And what's happened since then is the different state-based organisations, so the Victorian organisation, the Victorian Organisation of People Living with HIV.
Positive Living Victoria.
Positive Living Victoria. Positive Living Victoria has taken up the idea of, well, there were many Victorians who contributed to the book, and so let's have a launch here in Victoria, which is a great idea because it's an opportunity for those people to get up and speak and talk about how they contributed to the document as well.
And at a great venue in Melbourne for spoken word, Hares and Hyenas Bookshop, down in Johnson Street in Fitzroy, which many listeners would be familiar with in Melbourne. There's many vibrant spoken word events happening down at Hares and Hyenas, and that's where this book's being launched again. John, I think before we discuss the making of the book, perhaps could we hear a piece from the book just to give listeners a sense?
Oh, sure. Perhaps I'll just start with the foreword, which was written by Robert Mitchell, who's the president of NAPWA. And he says in his foreword, "It's my honour as the current president to present this collection of personal perspectives. It reminds those of us actively engaged with the response that we are custodians of the rich legacy of those who worked tirelessly throughout the course of the epidemic, and that the work we do is based on these contributions. The engagement of HIV-positive people has been a critical part of the Australian HIV response from the beginning of the epidemic. Clinicians, researchers, community advocates, policymakers, friends and families have supported and partnered with HIV-positive people to address the many tribulations and challenges that HIV has dealt us." So that's a bit of a flavour of then what's going to follow.
So the book's very much a mixture of HIV-positive voices with also people that have worked in the sector and health specialists. So it's a broad range of voices in Through Our Eyes.
That's right, yes, and the intention was to get a broad range of voices, and over 80 people were asked to contribute. Luckily, not all 80 responded. That would have been very difficult to manage that number in terms of editing the work, but over 50 people said that they wanted to be involved and contributed really their short, sharp, personal pieces of writing, and that may be from the experience of being a person living with HIV, and that includes women living with HIV, people talking about living heterosexually with HIV, gay men talking about living with HIV, Indigenous perspectives on the experience, and as well, very generously, clinicians and researchers and some of the other, as you say, people who have worked alongside HIV-positive people over many years also contributed, and that's a very nice effort.
I noticed Dr. Anne Mitch is in the book, and she's well known. She was at the forefront of the early response to HIV/AIDS, and she moved around across Australia, always at the cutting edge wherever a new treatment centre was being established. Anne would be there giving her experience and advice, and she went on to Papua New Guinea to work there as well. An amazing contribution.
Fantastic.
And some other very experienced writers in the book too. Dennis Altman.
That's right, Dennis Altman and David Menadue from Melbourne, who had his own book called Positive, published many years ago.
Yep, and Elizabeth Reed, who's well known in the international sector.
Yes, Elizabeth Reed, and Kirsty Machin, who now lives here in Melbourne. Michael Hurley. Graham Brown, there's
Perhaps
quite
we
a few.
could hear from one of those voices, John.
Sure, I'll try to find one straight away. That's from a Victorian voice here. And yes, one of the Victorian voices is Dr. Jennifer Hoy, and you mentioned the importance of the work of Anne Mitch over many years. Equally, Jennifer Hoy has made an amazing contribution.
At the Alfred.
That's right, that's right. So Jennifer's piece is in the first part of the book, and the first part of the book we called it's called the early years, really, and for those years we called from 1982 to 1989. So I'll just read the first paragraph from Jennifer Hoy's article, and hers was titled Altruism Shown by So Many Individuals. I left Fairfield Hospital in 1984 to complete my infectious diseases training in the United States when there were no patients with AIDS, and returned in 1988 to take up the position of head clinical research. What a difference 4 years made. Our clinics were overflowing. Ward 4 at Fairfield Hospital was full of brave men fighting a disease that we learnt something new about every day. We learnt so much about humanity as well, the stigma and discrimination experienced by those with HIV and their families, and the stark contrast of some members of the general public offering their homes to care for dying patients whose families had rejected them. We relied so much on the volunteers and carers who rallied to help individuals remain at home if that was where they wanted to be. We saw patients more often than our friends. Our patients often became our friends, and we attended so many funerals in those early days. We fought together for a better quality of life, then a longer and better quality of life, to now a good quality of life for the majority. So Jennifer's is one of the really quite amazing contributions from Victoria in the first part of the book. And the other people from Victoria who have contributed at the beginning here are Beverly Greet and David Menadue.
Would you like to read from?
Sure.
I also remember those early days of the stigma was very, very intense in those days. So the hospital, Fairfield itself, was a sanctuary for people as well as a place where people were sick and suffering. It was also a place where a community sense had been established also, which at least when you were at Fairfield Hospital, you felt a sense of belonging, and this is your place to recover. And yeah, sure.
And David Menadue's story echoes exactly what you're saying. And perhaps I'll just read the last two paragraphs of David's to give an idea of how David's taken in what happened in the early years, but also in a kind of reflective mode. Those early days are seared in my memory as both liberating on a personal level. There was something very empowering to work with peers on what was really a fight for our lives at the time, but frustrating and saddening as we tried to survive with limited resources, usually provided under programs of the goodwill of AIDS councils, and tried to cope with the increased mortality of our friends, which was occurring all around us. Thank goodness we did survive as a movement, and that people with HIV have become central to the response to the epidemic, empowered to fight for our rights and to improve the lives of so many people. Yeah, it was an amazing piece by David, going back over many years.
And you're listening to the voice of John Rule from the National Association of People with HIV/AIDS, who's edited and coordinated the book Through Our Eyes. And this is Spoken Word on Community Radio 3CR, and we'll have a short music break and we'll return to some more readings from this great book. John Rule, in putting together the book, I noticed in the early section of the book there's a huge section of acronyms, and I remember someone making a joke once that a comedy fundraiser for HIV/AIDS back in the 90s, which It used to be called PLWA back then.
That's right,
People
yeah.
living with AIDS. Before it became people living with HIV/AIDS. But someone made the joke, PLWA, which was people living with acronyms.
Yes, that's right. Well, you know, to survive all the acronyms is a survival in itself, isn't it?
Yeah. I wonder if there's anybody who actually knows them, or I guess you do now, because you've collated them.
Well, I don't know. As you say, there are 2 pages of him here we've had to put together. But it was an important distinction that we had to make as we put this document together, because the change in language actually signalled changes in people's direct experience from, of course, the expectation of living with AIDS to now living with HIV. And we can only everybody celebrates that change in language, so we've got to make sure we stay on top of it.
And it's getting that message out into the broader community as well. I think inside the HIV community there's a lot of understanding that because of the existence of very effective pharmaceutical treatments, that we're not seeing cases of AIDS in Australia anymore, and in most parts of the world that have access to the treatments, that's also the case. So that's why we're talking about people living with HIV, because the distinction is that HIV is the name of the actual virus that infects a person, where AIDS is a particular category of medical conditions that a person only gets once their immune system's been depleted by the HIV virus. They get these particular illnesses known as AIDS-related conditions. But because of these treatments being so effective, people's immune systems aren't falling to those low levels, so we're not seeing AIDS. So that's why that terminology has changed. And would you like to read a piece that perhaps reflects upon the change?
Oh, sure. I think this is an interesting one, and this is from Beverly Greet, who's a Victorian. And
founding member of Positive Women in Victoria.
That's right, yes. And Beverly has a particularly, honourable spot in this, the beginning here, because her piece is called HIV-Positive People Now Had a National Voice. So Bev is offering some reflection on some important first national gatherings of people, then people with AIDS, but now people living with HIV. I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from Bev's. There was a sense of urgency at this time, as stigma and discrimination were rife, and we had all been given a death sentence. In the closing ceremony, she's reflecting on a conference here in Melbourne, in Hobart, this conference, we bravely got up on stage and declared our HIV positive status to the audience. We said that we must be part of the solution to the AIDS crisis. This was a groundbreaking act, and later, the first ever conference organised by and for people with AIDS, AIDS-related conditions and HIV, and their lovers, partners and close friends was held at Fairfield Hospital in Melbourne. Bev goes on to say, I spoke at this conference representing the newly formed Positive Women Victoria. We, as women living with HIV, were no longer invisible. It was at this conference that the National People Living with AIDS Coalition, so that's an acronym, I guess, and the acronym was NAPWA, which was a funny one that everyone's always laughed at, that was formed, and that was later to be named NAPWA, which was the organisation has put the document together, was formed. And Bev says, finishes by saying, HIV positive people now had a voice. So that was kind of how we've constructed the first section of the document, by saying, well, yes, there are these difficult times, everyone's offered reflection on those. People like Bill Botel, his little piece says the radicals were right. It was important to stand up at that time. Ross Duffin from New South Wales talks about the best and the worst of times. Professor Sue Kippax, a social researcher, talks about how partnership work was central to the research projects. Martin French, immunologist from Western Australia, talks about responding to a health emergency. We've heard from Jennifer Hoy. Bill Patterson talks about through his eyes, and Elizabeth Reed talks about the role of caring and living with the dying. And Elizabeth's was a piece that was drawn from that first conference that Bev talked about.